Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
Sonoro.
This week on the pod, Vanessa Vancour joins me to discuss the power of authentic storytelling, how we can all be savvy consumers of media, and why it's important more than ever before to seek out and celebrate community as we enter this new era. Vanessa is a Mexican-American award-winning storyteller, bilingual editorial consultant, and Latinx marketer with a career committed to lifting diverse narratives and meaningful conversations into her work. Vanessa joins me for the entirety of this episode, and Delsy will be back soon. Welcome to Tamarindo Podcast, hosted by me, Brenda Gonzalez, a fitness coach, political nerd, and nonprofit capacity builder.
And me, Delsy Sandoval, a Guatemalan-American licensed therapist and passionate creativity advocate. Together, we're here to uplift our community through powerful conversations with changemakers, creatives, and healers.
Each week on the pod, we talk politics, culture, and personal development. Listeners call Tamarindo the Advocacy and Self-Love Podcast. Vámonos! Let's start the show. Welcome, Vanessa. It's so wonderful to have you here on Tamarindo.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor.
Yes, this is really, really happy for me. It brings a lot of happiness for me to have you on. I know you've been a longtime fan, so we've been Instagram friends for a while, but it's great to bring you on to this conversation. So we normally do a temperature check, or what we call our ¿Qué pasa? So how are you feeling? What is your ¿Qué pasa? What is your vibe as you get into 2025?
I love the way you start and end your shows, so I was excited to do this with you. A couple of things come to mind when I think about the vibe. Is part of me always wishes that we could take the whole month of January off, because while I appreciate the excitement of the new year and setting intentions and hitting the ground running, I also think, just a product of it being winter, that this still feels like a reset, slow down period. And so I'm excited to get the year started and jump into 2025. And the other part of me is really just evaluating rest. And part of that has also been evaluating what it means to be in relationship with people, with myself. Like, I think it's naturally a very reflective time of year. So I spend a lot of time reflecting, but also I think with everything that's happening in the world, in Los Angeles, what's happening politically, I just feel like I'm just spending a lot of time thinking about how I want to come into this year in relationship to others and with others, and really trying not to rush into anything as much as I can help it, you know?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. We're recording this a little before the inauguration. I'm just trying to not even be aware of what's happening. So listeners are probably hearing this right after that man has been, is now the president, which is just so crazy to me that we're here. And so I really appreciate you thinking about approaching this year in a way that you're mindful of how you're feeling and staying attuned to that, because we're going to need to be really attuned to that, like making sure that we're informed and staying aware, but also taking care of ourselves as we consume the news and everything that's happening around us. So yes, I appreciate you sharing how you're feeling. I similarly, going into this second episode of the year of Tamarindo, after the aftermath of the fires, we know there's still a long road to recovery. I'm feeling a little bit, for now, hopefully it's not short-lived, but for a second now, I will go ahead and embrace the feeling of relief right now, because it sounds like the winds have calmed for a little bit, and hopefully we're able to not see the fires grow. I've seen the fires be starting to be contained, but it is a little bit, I'm feeling anxious as we see how the president is probably going to find any way to make California pay, quote unquote, for, or do cartwheels, I don't know, to get disaster relief. So there's a lot of anxiety there leading into it. All right, we checked in how we're doing. We checked our pulse. We see how we're doing. Now, I want to go back to you. I want our listeners to know a little bit about you. So, first of all, you have many Latinas, right? We have so many different titles, so many hyphens in all the work that we do. But I think you're really a storyteller. And I think that's probably at the core of the work that you do. But to let our listeners know, give us a little bit, like a brief synopsis of your journey into launching your own business, into launching Vancourage, which, by the way, is a great name. Tell us your journey to that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's funny. I always tell people I was pretty vocal throughout my life about never wanting to be an entrepreneur, because I just think it's so scary. And I have so much admiration for business owners and entrepreneurs, but that's not how life works. And so I started my business 3 years ago because I was laid off, and I wasn't finding opportunities that were in alignment with the things that I wanted to do. And it just started to become so much more clear to me that that was really important to me. I wanted to work on projects and with people that I felt like we were sharing values and that the work was having an impact. And so thanks to a friend of mine, I was able to start my business. They brought me my first client, and I invested a lot of time and resources into really defining my brand and working with my brand strategist on the importance of being really explicit on who I was and who I wasn't. And so my whole career, I, like you mentioned, was a storyteller. I was a journalist. I was a bilingual journalist. And then I eventually pivoted and worked in digital media. I taught journalism at the University of Nevada, Reno. But the thread was always storytelling, culture, and bilingualism. And so in launching my business, I thought, wouldn't it be such a dream if I got to get paid to do that and pick the people I want to work with and work with clients that are really committed to uplifting voices and experiences that otherwise aren't thought of, even if that includes thinking about campaigns as multicultural campaigns or bilingual content. And so that's how it came to be. And I just feel so fortunate that for the last 3 years, I've been busy and have been able to really build it and do projects that I believe in. And hopefully I get to continue to do that, amplifying the stories that matter and working in collaboration with people like you. So that's how I got my start. And my heart will always be in storytelling. That was my first love, and it will always be.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about your background as a journalist. And I know you teach journalism. And I could tell that you're really passionate about bilingual stories and making sure that our stories are told. What we are noticing is that there's this growing trend of well, first of all, we're not really represented in newsrooms as it is, but the few publications that had dedicated spaces for Latinos, like for instance, Axio Latino, no longer exists. So I want to know, what is your take on the dismal amount of Spanish language media as well as Latina dedicated newsrooms or segments of newsrooms? What are your thoughts on this scary trend, and what's at stake for our community?
It's such a great question, and it's something that I have been a part of or observing or supporting since 2005, 2006. So about 20 years of being in this space, from my time as a journalism student in Southern California to my work professionally. And about 9 years ago, I founded a bilingual media program here in Reno for students at the University of Nevada because I noticed exactly what you're saying. And this was 9 years ago. So in Northern Nevada, where I live, Latinos make up about a quarter of our population. And back then I was noticing we barely had Univision. We had a few Spanish radio stations that were mostly entertainment. And there was this noticeable gap of information, not just in our language for those of us who consume media in Spanish, but just being represented in the other stations. So I, got some funding to start this program called Noticiero Móvil with the intent of addressing this gap, but also training the next generation of storytellers and journalists and really telling them and showing them that their language is an asset and that their culture is an asset. And one of the things that I have always believed is that it's nice to have these publications or media organizations that are specifically for us because those spaces are safe. There's an abundance of content. But I wish I saw us woven in a little bit more. And that became one of my talking points during my time, is that when I would go meet with editors or newsroom leaders, they liked the idea. They saw the economic benefit of the Latino market because we know that the economic impact is tremendous and growing, but they wanted to reserve us for this little section over here. And I thought, I'm just so sick of these special sections. We should be the people you're interviewing about any story about the economy. It's not just limiting us to subjects that reinforce these stereotypes. We care about education, we care about workforce development, we care about health and wellness. And so I think as I'm seeing, unfortunately, as you said, we are still seeing headlines of newsrooms shutting down like Axios, which is such a loss to us. I hope that the people who exist in newsrooms that are not explicitly Latino, particularly the people that have some power or some influence, continue to advocate for diversifying the people who are being interviewed and the voices that are being amplified, because I think really that's the way to do it. You look at the success of something like Alt Latino and the Tiny Desk series, just thinking about the way that NPR has done that. That has been largely driven by Felix Contreras, who's been there forever. And, thanks to him, we've seen it grow. And also just thanks to the power of Latinos in the US, we're seeing, I think, a lot more representation. So I think it always breaks my heart when I see a headline that something is closing. And I think, okay, how can we weave ourselves in other ways? Where are the places where this is still happening that could be funded or supported? And, I think even us just sharing that content helps those kinds of institutions,
Mm-hmm. As you're answering this, what I'm starting to think about is, in the absence of these journalists, right? These spaces to tell our stories, or these legitimate places to tell our stories, there is at the same time this growing, I don't even want, independent's not the right word, but just these people turning to TikTok or turning to other more forms of media. To a certain extent, podcasting is part of this, to then tell a story, but it's not vetted. It's not through any journalism standards, and it's a place. It's a kind of complicated because in one part, it's if there's nowhere else for us to tell our stories, we have to take it upon ourselves. And so many of us have done that. But with the lack of, without being able to adhere to journalistic standards, there's also the risk of a lot of misinformation, a lot of lies, a lot of ways that information can be manipulated. And maybe that's even maybe the evidence of that is in the way that so many Latinos came out and voted for Trump, for instance. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on so many of us kind of taking it upon ourselves to be citizen journalists.
I love seeing content on my feed made by people with whom I feel a connection, that are poking fun at our Mexican moms because, they all say the same things, the content that I'm sharing with my family and with my friends because it's connecting us and relating. As a journalist, though, I do really believe in the integrity of the industry and journalistic ethics and the importance of fact checking and transparency. And I do still have a lot of faith and hope in journalism as a profession. And where I do see a lot of really excellent journalism happening is in independent media, in nonprofit newsrooms. And as we're seeing these major newsrooms announce shutdowns or scaling teams down, I am seeing a lot of hopeful movement and funding happening in the nonprofit journalism sector. And I think the other thing is that people will often point to a lack of critical media literacy as a way to criticize or diminish people's intellectual abilities. And I would rather believe that we are really savvy consumers. And for the most part, most of us are critically consuming content. And the other reality is most of us are also consuming content that we already agree with. And so I think if we want to be supportive of the people who are producing information and sharing information that is truthful and factual, that's the content we should be sharing for those of us who are willing to take those extra few moments. And I just, for me, there will always be a distinction between a content creator and a journalist. And for me, it is that line of training of going the extra step to verify what someone said, to dig through documents. There are so many amazing investigative journalists still doing this work, but I think it's really up to us as consumers who care about that to be sure that we're only sharing the information that is coming from a credible source, that when a loved one shares an article with us with some gossipy headline, do the extra work to click through and figure out, well, who's the team here? And, oh, it turns out this is being funded by so-and-so. And, even if the person, you're never going to convince them otherwise, just letting them know, hey, FYI, this isn't actually a news site. This is an agenda-driven, this and this, and you should be aware of that. So I just think it's up to us as the people who care about such things to be sharing those things. And there are so many incredible journalists doing that work. And I think those are the people we should be looking for in the next few years as we try to combat intentional spreading of misinformation, which is just going to keep happening, especially given Meta's recent announcement around, fact checking or lack thereof of information. We just have to be, those of us who care need to be more responsible.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that we all bear some responsibility, especially those of us that have the skill set to do the research that might be needed, just the 2 more steps before you share something. So that's one thing. I also liked that you gave us a little bit of hope here in calling out that there is an increase in nonprofit funded newsrooms. That's a different model. We're seeing that happen in Los Angeles and different places. It's a different model than your traditional media that is dependent on ads. And so it's interesting. We'll see, because nonprofits are absolutely one vehicle to get the information out, but they're not flawless. There's so many ways we got to protect ourselves. But I am kind of interested in this notion that I do believe that we do have a lot of savvy consumers of media, but at the same time, I do think there's room for more education on how to determine, how to decipher what is legitimate, what isn't. Have you seen any examples of this emerging, or could this be a call to action for us to maybe start something where we're doing a little bit more of media literacy? Tell me your thoughts on that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my gosh. Yes. When I was teaching at the university, which was between 2014 and 2019, one of the classes I taught was social media. And I had an entire lecture dedicated to social verification. And it was one of my favorite lessons to teach, because I often felt that my students, who were undergrads, juniors, seniors, came into this lesson thinking, this is going to be so easy. It's so obvious when something's fake. So we would go through this process of how to verify a bit of information, and I would give them memes or graphics of, for example, one graphic that had statistics about gun violence. There was another graphic that had quotes from different senators and political leaders. that otherwise looked pretty legitimate. And so they would break up into teams and have to figure out what parts of it were real and were not. And what they learned in this process is that sometimes the information on these graphics was correct. It could be linked to a credible piece of research that had been conducted by a reputable institution. However, maybe the research was outdated. Maybe it was taken out of context. In one case, one of the quotes from a political leader was related to violence against women, which is something they had said many, many years ago and had since then retracted the statement, come back on the record as standing in favor of something. And so there's so much nuance in misinformation. And so at the time, I was trying to develop media literacy education with high schools in our county. And I actually think we should be teaching it much younger because so many young people at very, very young ages have access to social media, which is really, really scary. And at least what I'm learning through my daughters who are in 8th grade and sophomore in high school, they're not taking it. They're talking about politically, current events, but I don't know how much they're actually dedicating to dissecting the credibility of information. So yeah, I care about this a lot. And I wish we had more education for people of all ages, because I think also access to information is a way that we spread misinformation. And so looking at different funding models, we have a lot of information that sits behind a paywall. That's not accessible to everybody. And so these newsrooms that are exploring other ways to sustain themselves while making their information accessible is part of the challenge of also just like paying their staff a livable wage, but producing content that's important for communities to make informed decisions.
So many barriers here, so many challenges. So while we may not have all the solutions, these are just some things to be aware of, being aware of the steps that we could take, the responsibility that we bear, and just this ever-changing ecosystem of how we consume information, because it's got to be a snippet, it's got to be quick, it's got to be a video. Articles have even changed. They're now bullet points, which, I mean, whatever it takes to get the right information out, let's try it. Okay. Now, I want to transition a little bit. You're also a public speaker, and you talk a lot about the importance of showing up authentically. I want to know about this. Like, why does this matter to you? Why is it important to show up authentically, and especially in this particular moment in time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because as I've mentioned and we've talked about, I've spent my whole career devoted to storytelling in some capacity, and it's always been in commitment to other people's stories. And so, in 2017, I was invited to give a TEDx talk, and I said no, because I never, ever considered that my story had any value or merit. And I never thought it was interesting enough to be shared with other people. And so I obviously said yes and ended up doing this talk about implicit bias. That experience for me really showed me that my story was valuable. And more importantly, it was the connections I formed after with other people reaching out to me saying, I can relate so much to you, or thank you for saying this. I've often felt this and didn't have language or vocabulary for it. And so it's funny because a couple of years ago, I gave a talk at a women's conference about storytelling, but I wrote the talk within the context of female in leadership in the workplace. And when we got to the Q&A, most of the questions were about personal stories, how to know our story, how to own our story, how to tell our story, not within the context of a professional woman, but as just me as a woman existing in this world. How do I do that? And because they suddenly felt really inspired to do that. And I thought, oh my gosh, I totally missed the mark. Like, who cares about professional? I mean, obviously that matters for creating spaces of belonging at work, but I think just sharing with people that like your story and your experience is important, and it will impact people in ways that you can't even imagine.
Now, I love hearing that because one of my favorite podcasts, and I've talked a lot about it on this podcast, is Risk. It's the Risk Show podcast. It's all about authentic stories and just people telling their lived experience, and they work hard to try to call in diverse voices, because I think what I love is the host of the podcast is Kevin Allison, and he's a white man, but he's a queer white man, but I think he really is a type of person that is very aware of his privilege and is always trying to think of ways to expand to new communities. And I think in doing that, personal stories are really a great tool to call people in and to think differently about communities that they may not know about, or that they had, like you said, implicit bias, they had some misconceptions about. So that's part of the power of storytelling. Now, I want to talk a little bit about right now, I think people like you often get hired, or were often hired by corporations to talk to maybe their employee resource groups and things like that. But right now, another conversation that's happening around us is we've seen a lot of companies pull back from diversity, equity, and inclusion. And maybe they're not even thinking of, like, for instance, I can imagine a world where a corporation might want to hire you to lead a storytelling workshop so that folks can feel empowered. Like you mentioned, it builds a safe environment at work. But now we're seeing this toxic shift away from that. I want to know, what are your thoughts as we enter this space? How can we continue to make the case for initiatives and programs that build inclusion?
Mm-hmm. I'll start by saying that this backlash or attack, as some people are calling it, is not new. When I was hired at the university 11 years ago, I was called a diversity hire. There was a colleague, a white man, who said, I got the job because I was the only Latina candidate, not because of my qualifications. And that was 11 years ago.
That is so infuriating.
It is. It made me really sad, and I think to some degree, a lot of the work I did was often picturing that kind of persona, like wanting to prove them wrong. And then in that particular instance, because I was successful, meaning I raised money, I got national awards, that legitimized my work. And that kind of always felt like I see this is valuable because other people are valuing it, which is just another thing that I recognize it's important to be legitimized, but we can't let ourselves be so driven by that. But anyway, all this to say that none of this is new. And I was recently sharing with a friend that a lot of people who do work like I do are starting to experiment with different language. So maybe they're not calling themselves a DEI professional and using other language. So for instance, get hired a lot to do workshops or trainings with either employee resource groups or teams. I did a leadership training for higher education. I've worked with Microsoft. I've worked with the local jurisdictions. And I root my trainings in the idea of creating a space of belonging for everyone and addressing implicit bias. Because diversity initiatives and equity and inclusion initiatives at their core, and if done well, are really about the inclusion of everyone. With the asterisk that there are groups of people who are oppressed and marginalized in ways that others are not. And that's where I always draw the line is I teach my work through the lens of curiosity. Most people, most of the time, are not intending to be malicious. And there is room to have conversations where we can be curious about each other and ask questions in a way that invites dialogue instead of shaming or pushing people away. The majority of the time, this is what we encounter. And again, where I draw the line is if someone is explicitly hateful, absolutely, I have personally no room to be curious and nor to engage in conversation, and recognizing that I risk less than other people because I present as a white woman. So I am able to code switch a lot more easily than my Afro-Latina friends or my queer friends who are people of color, I have access to conversations and spaces, and the feedback I get is that I present training in a way that feels accessible to everybody. And that's my goal, is to teach these things in a way where, I'll start by saying all of us in this room belong to groups that have been stereotyped. And the example I'll give, as sort of lighthearted example is, when I tell you to imagine someone who does CrossFit, what comes to mind? Because many of us have these stereotypical ideas of like the person who's super into CrossFit, and people will laugh. And it's like, I don't do CrossFit. I have no right making assumptions about who a CrossFit person is. So, think about all the places, the intersections in which you exist as a human being that might be stereotyped. As a single mom, as a woman, as a person who works in a male-dominated industry. And so that's the way that I'm preparing for this continued dismantling of this really important work, is thinking about how I'm showing up. And I'm not going to change my teaching style or the things that I'm teaching, because it's all related to inclusion. And I really am trying to have a very hopeful outlook in all of this sadness and despair, because I keep reminding myself that there are still lots of people out there committed to this work, and there are lots of people doing really good work. And I just need to find them and continue to hopefully work with them, because if we were to just look at the way that our country voted, there are still an overwhelming number of people who are aligned in values and who believe in good things, So it's just, I'll go back to like the very beginning of this. Like, we just have to be really committed to taking care of ourselves, but also taking care of each other, and paying attention to the rhetoric and the language that's being used to dismantle all of this. Because if you pay attention, a lot of the ways in which this work is being delegitimized is through singular stories, like this one example of this one thing that doesn't consider complexity and context and intersectionality. And so back to storytelling, that's where, if we tell stories that not only counter those narratives, but show complexity, show intersections in identity, in multitudes, that can continue to sort of discount these very single-minded narratives that are trying to, delegitimize the work that we're all doing, this podcast included,
I love that. It all comes back to storytelling, right? It all comes back to being able to share our story authentically. And I think you've given us a lot of a hopeful outlook as we go into this week with the new administration, and that reminder that there's so many more of us that are working towards that, building that inclusive world that we want to see, and staying grounded in that. And also to not let cynicism take over, because that's the other challenge that I find myself facing, is that I know that I'm not going to win over some folks on the right. I'm not interested. Like you said, like, if you're going to be hateful, I don't have the time for that. But what is really challenging and frustrating and hurtful is the folks that I know that we share the same values, but have succumbed to cynicism. And that is very difficult to combat. That is very difficult to combat. Do you have some thoughts on that too?
Oh, yeah. No, I feel like I felt everything you said in my body when you were saying that, because I could picture people in my life that way. And I get it. I think that a lot of people are right to feel tired, and, but I also know that that's how they want us to feel feel beat down and defeated. And it's in those moments where my approach is like, give that person or people the space to do that. If I have more energy to step up, that's an opportunity to do that, but I get it. I get why people are just so tired. But I think it's like anything in life, if you're looking for it, you're going to see it. Mm-hmm. But if you're consciously consuming information and content and stories that continuously remind you that there is good and that there is hope and that there is possibility, that's just going to inform the way that you show up in every part of your life. And so I as a journalist, I remember in the 2016 election and even this last election, I intentionally consumed less media. And I felt irresponsible in the sense that I thought, I do have more privilege than others. Willful ignorance should never be an option, but I just knew that I couldn't only handle so much. And then I had friends that were just watching the news nonstop or listening, and I could see how it was affecting their mental health. And I'd say, it's good to be informed, but shut it off. Shut it off, take a break, regroup. Because the other thing too is I think local community and your immediate community is also, I think, where we can find hope. And so when you start to look at this giant picture, the administration on a federal level, it feels overwhelming. It feels super far. It feels like there's nothing I could possibly do to move that needle. But when you focus your energy to your immediate circle, your immediate family, your local politics, your local libraries, your school board, that's where change starts to feel possible. And, in terms of storytelling, there's a model in journalism that I tell my clients about called the solutions journalism framework. And it's this idea that in lieu of continuing to diagnose an issue, if we can tell stories that reflect what worked and what hasn't worked, but more importantly, models of what is working, then it starts to feel hopeful, because now I have this tangible thing I can look at and say, oh, okay, so in this community in Georgia, they're doing this thing and it's really amazing, And so I think as we're thinking of the stories that we're consuming, but telling, it's like when you start to pay attention, thinking of our cynical friends, okay, all of those things are true and the way you feel is completely justified. And are there any other glimmers of goodness or hope in the other experiences you're having in your life, So yeah, I know it's pretty obvious just talking to you, but I'm really trying to stay centered on all of those things because I don't want to lose hope. I don't want to lose energy. And I don't want to become cynical in any part of my life.
Yeah. That's perfect. People listening are going to be like, that's exactly how I want to feel. So the takeaways here is let's look for those glimmers. Let's lift up those solutions. Let's tell our authentic stories. Let's know when to pause, and let's be responsible consumers of media and journalism. I love all of this. So we've come to the conclusion of our conversation. And as I know you listen to this podcast, that you know that we like to ask our guests a certain number of questions. So first question I have for you, what is one thing that you're celebrating?
I feel very lucky in the work I get to do professionally in language access with organizations that are deeply committed to their communities. And so this week in particular, I am feeling so grateful for the people that I know and that I'm working with who are committed to the good work, and just super, super grateful that I get to be a part of that. That's what I'm celebrating this week, just deep admiration and respect for the people who are showing up and doing good work even when it's hard. I just feel like I've had a lot of conversations in recent weeks with people who work in domestic violence, people who work in organizing infrastructure, people who are committed to making government services accessible, those. I feel that's what I'm celebrating, are all of those people who are working really hard behind the scenes and may never get public recognition and are doing it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Look for the helpers, as we know that quote. That's great. I think what I'm celebrating right now is silly compared to your answer, which is way more thoughtful. But last night I started watching The Later Daters. This is a dating show of people in their 50s and 60s, even up to 70s. It is produced by Michelle Obama. It is awesome. I first of all, it's like a string of a number of dating shows on Netflix that I absolutely love. I love the Indian Matchmaker. I love the Jewish Matchmaker. I love Dating on the Spectrum. So now to add to that list of these feel-good shows that I absolutely love on Netflix is The Later Daters. Y'all, it's such joy. I was squealing. I was squealing when I see, after several dates, I see these two that are coming together right now where I'm at in this series. If you need to just have something joyful, please go watch this show. And thank you, Michelle Obama. I guess my other celebration is to Michelle Obama, who's saying, I'm not going to sit next to this fool and watch him get inaugurated. So I guess another matraca goes to Michelle Obama for both of those things. All right. So now, what is something that I can tell you have a very positive outlook. So this might be a challenge for you. But what is something that we're like putting in la basura? It could be big. It could be small. Whatever it is, what are you canceling?
I was journaling about this last night because there's so many things. Also around a full moon, I always do these rituals on what I'm letting go of. I am canceling this idea that I have held for a long time that good things can only be achieved or gotten through hard work or suffering. Like I've had this like internal belief that good things can't come with ease. And it's taken a lot of work to figure that out. But I just had this epiphany last night and I thought, you know what, that's what I'm going to really work hard to just echar a la basura. Like, why can't good things be easy? And, you know, like instead of waiting for the other shoe to drop, like, how about this is how it's supposed to be, you know? So that's my basura. That's what I'm tossing.
I love it.
It can be easy. It's supposed to be easy. And it doesn't always have to be this like struggle or like big obstacle, you know?
I love that. Yep. Yeah. What if it was just easy? What if it was just easy to achieve your dreams? Do we need to work hard? Do we? Like no pain, no gain. How about no pain and gain? You know,
all gain, all joy, all gain. It's easy. It feels good. The end, period.
Love, 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 love. Okay. What I'm putting in la basura, again, this is silly compared to your really thoughtful answer. I'm putting in la basura pet fees at hotels. Like, it is so annoying. I am right now because Jeff and we have most of the day off today and part of tomorrow. We're kind of playing with the idea of getting a cool room at this hotel that we really like in San Diego. But their pet fee is $100, like $100 for my 12-pound pup. Like, come on, dude. So we're not going to go to that. We're not going to go to. Oh, yes, thank you. Producer Jeff has chimed in that the other thing that goes in la basura along with the pet fees is the parking fees that are sometimes like $50. So those two things, these hidden fees that are just ridiculous when you go get a room. All right, that goes in la basura. And then what is something that is giving you inspiración, keeping you inspired?
Right now, Bad Bunny. Debí tirar más fotos. I have been obsessively, obnoxiously consuming that album since it came out on January 5th. And I am eating up every piece of content I can of everything he's doing, the way people are responding to it, these public celebrations. And as it relates to our conversation, Bad Bunny's album does so many things in connecting us, but he also did such a beautiful job in writing historically relevant and accurate pieces into his music. And in thinking about why it's important for us to tell our stories, that album and his work he's doing through all of the content is directly related to why we have to tell our stories and write them the way that we experience them. Because I know I shared this with you in an email, but I have this Post-it note on my desk about the importance of documentation of stories. And it says, documentation of stories are reminders to ourselves from ourselves. White supremacy is about erasing us as we remembered us. And so this album to me is about erasure. It's about what was taken, what's still being threatened to be taken. And it's also this loud love and celebration of culture. And I am just eating that up. It's just, for me, it's just this like joyful dance party that is reminding me of all of these things that relate to everything we talked about. And I just cannot get enough.
Yes, yes. We all know the songs are catchy, they're meaningful, they're joyful, they're what we need to carry us into this year. So I think that's a wonderful inspiración. What I'm going to call in for inspiración is, we all know that the TikTok the TikTok ban is probably going to happen. We're maybe may or may not have TikTok much longer. And I was consuming TikTok. And one of the videos that was so captivating that I recently watched was a indigenous woman in Peru describing in great detail how to make wool and the process of for hundreds of years of getting the wool from the sheep, the natural dyes, the skill it takes to like turn that wool into one thread. She has such a soothing voice as she describes this rich history and process and tradition. She talks about how all the women need to be really good at tejer, of like making these garments and sweaters, because if they're not, then they won't get a husband. That the one of the things that they are required to do to win a husband over is they have to make something for the mother-in-law, and the mother-in-law has to approve the quality of the work. So it was fascinating. I learned so much on this TikTok. So I guess RIP TikTok and some of the inspiration that brings. And of course, I'll be remiss if I don't use this opportunity to remind everybody that we are still accepting applications for Encuentro, where I assure you, you will leave inspired. This will be on May 2nd through the 6th. You're invited. It's going to be fantastic. You're invited, Vanessa, and all of our listeners are, of course, invited. And I'll give you a testament. I recently went to visit my friend Ileana, who went to the first inaugural Encuentro retreat. She, at the time, was a corporate leader, and she said that going to Encuentro and the cohort of women that she got to speak to and connect with opened up for her, or let her tap in, gave her the permission to tap into her creative soul. And I saw it at her house, and every single corner of her house is just incredibly thoughtfully decorated. And she says, it's funny that you note that, because that all came from Encuentro, from unlocking that creativity. Like, I don't need to be a designer for other people, but I can do it for myself and do it for joy. So that's like Ileana's testament of what she was able to unlock by being at Encuentro. All right. With that, Vanessa, thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to promote or tell people to check out? Please use this opportunity to do so.
No, I just want to say thank you so much. And I said this to you earlier. I have been a longtime fan of yours and of the show. And I just thank you, because you're in the work that you both are doing on this podcast is exactly what we talked about. It is making a space for people to share their stories and inspire and motivate and drive. And just like, it's a constant reminder. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Tamarindo Podcast is Brenda Gonzalez and Delsy Sandoval. We are also the show's executive producers. Jeff Ricards wrote our theme song. Sonoro Media's Karina Riveroll provides production support, and Cliva Torres edits our episodes for YouTube. The best way to support our work is to rate and review Tamarindo or share an episode with a friend. Get in touch with us at tamarindopodcast.com.
Sonoro.
I'm not going to lie, you're slacking. You're slacking on starting that business you've been holding off on. It's just living in your head. And if you don't act now, that idea is going to leave, or maybe someone's going to take that idea. And there's a tool that I personally use, and that is Shopify. You don't need to be a web designer. You can just start moving, zooming in, adding the text you need, adding pictures you need. And Shopify has so many templates you can use from. Get it out of your head and onto a website with Shopify. Shopify makes it simple to create your brand, open for business, and get your first sell. They make it easy to manage growing your business. They help with details like shipping, taxes, and payments from one single dashboard, allowing you to focus on all the important stuff like growing your business. With Shopify, your first sale is closer than you think. Established in 2025 has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/sonoro, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/sonoro to start selling with Shopify today. Shopify.com/sonoro.
These are violent criminals, so they're not going to go down easy.
ABC Tuesdays.
Let's get this done.
The Rookie is back.
We have 2 new rookies starting today.
Howdy.
Being a cop is stressful 24/7. Every year on the job is different.
And Training Day.
We have a serial killer at large.
Never ends.
We need an ambulance!
The Rookie. All new Tuesdays on ABC and stream on Hulu.